Today we're talking about the book, Harvard University Press, 2026, Captive Minds, A Study of Manipulation by Avishai, Margalit, and Assaf, Sharon. Welcome, gentlemen.
Happy to be here.
Yes.
Let me just read a little bit from the flap and an endorsement. The flap says, manipulation is as old as history itself, yet Aldous Huxley's paraphrase of Churchill rings truer than ever. Never have so many been manipulated so much by so few. Manipulation presents a clear danger to liberal democracy today. For example, demagogues undermine civic discussion, and propagandists and conspiracy theorists create cognitive traps that erode critical thinking. And one endorsement from Michael Walzer, Margalit and Sharon give us a brilliant account of manipulation, showing it to be the central means of acquiring and exercising power today. By revealing how manipulation works, they enable us to work against it. Their book is a powerful call for democratic reason, beautifully illustrated with examples drawn from history and literature. One of the things you say, as far as your framework, is that you emphasize power. And when I hear that term, I think Foucault, but that's not exactly your approach. Could you say something about what that means to you, that you're seeing through a lens of power?
Sure. So in general, philosophers, in the 20th century, gave little consideration to manipulation. And especially in liberal thought, the focus of thinking about liberty or freedom was against the backdrop of coercion. So when is coercion justified? What are the limits of justified coercion, etc.? And one of our motivations was to explore this counterpart of manipulation, which was largely neglected. But when I say largely neglected, it wasn't totally neglected, of course. And then we noticed that when philosophers did concern themselves with manipulation, they tended to do so under one of two titles. One is rationality. So manipulation is a kind of irrational influence over somebody else. The second is truth. So manipulation is a kind of sneaky or devious deception. And from the get-go, it seemed to us that this was getting something right, but also something wrong. Both truth and rationality play an important role in unpacking how manipulation works, but they are not the essence of manipulation. Manipulation does not have to be irrational, nor does it have to be deceptive. And the way that we wanted to approach it is by looking at manipulation not as primarily as a kind of interpersonal kind of relationship or influence, but more as a social or political phenomenon. And when you think about it in that context, the notion of power, not in the Foucauldian sense, but in the very common sense, I would even say Hobbesian sense, of the ability to influence what other people do, manipulation becomes a central means of exerting power over other people.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. So a lot of the first part of your book is kind of trying to get clear about how we should speak. You can use manipulation casually, but you want to get a meaning that is more useful, I guess a technical meaning. And you say that this is not conceptual analysis. You're not doing conceptual analysis. Could you explain what that means?
Well, conceptual analysis is the main task of analytical philosophy. And part of it is that you analyze a concept within a frame or not within a frame, but we are interested in concepts that play a role in history, and namely that the historical context is crucial. It's not just illustrative, but it should be illuminating within a context. And therefore, the combination is of decomposing concepts, yes, we do it, but the main thrust is to provide the context in which this is functioning.
Okay, and I found it very helpful, your discussion. I think one of the distinctions was between coerce and compel, which are, I think, are used synonymously. But in your context, you want to look at, as I understand, well, in your context, what is the difference between coercion and compulsion?
Well, compulsion would be the more general term designating any kind of influence over somebody else that, as we call it, dominates them or imposes the will of one person over another. And the way people are compelled by other people can be either by coercion or by manipulation. Some people can talk about being compelled by one's own psychology, right? You can think about kind of the psychological notion of, obsessive compulsive disorder. So this would be the general term for the kinds of influences that take control away from the person over their own behavior. And within this broader term, we think that there's two important distinctions to be made. One is whether this compulsion is by other people or not. So if it's your own psychology, that's a different situation. And then within the compulsion by other people, there's a helpful distinction that we try to make between compulsion by way of coercion, namely the exertion of physical force or the threat of the use of physical force or sanction, and manipulation, which is a mode of compulsion not by means of physical force or threat.
Right. I understand. Thank you. So coercion, it has a sense of violence or physical force in it.
Yes. Or sanction that is painful. I mean, if I'm your boss, I can threaten to fire you.
Yeah.
And that can be compelling too. That can be a form of coercion. It's even recognized by law as a form of coercion. And the important thing for us to unpack manipulation and its parity with coercion is precisely this notion of being compelled by other people. Because when somebody else compels you, not circumstances or your own psychology, your will is being dominated or controlled by somebody else. And that is a loss of the fundamental freedom that we think political institutions should try to protect.
And how do you put in this framework, say I'm compelled to be homeless because I don't have any income? Would that come under compulsion? Or so it's not someone doing it, it's kind of like a systematic effect.
You mean the conditions of life that cannot be imputed to a specific agent?
Yes.
Then it depends. If the situation is historically or genetically started with manipulation, then you would rather try to track down the history and find the origin of it. If it's systematic to the point in which it's part of the structure, the sort of anonymous structure, then it's hard really. Then it's hard to say. It depends.
Right.
Really, here you have to be. This is why. I mean, why historical analysis here is crucial, namely
how things came about.
That's fascinating. Okay. So one of the things I kept thinking about as I was reading this was whether there has to be a manipulator. Can you be manipulated if there is no manipulator? How do you see that? I would think there has to be someone that I can point to as the manipulator.
Namely, you need intentions, that it should be an intentional thing.
Exactly.
Right.
And therefore, where there is no intention but sheer structure that creates, or conditions of life, like poverty you mentioned, I mean a systematic poverty, right, that you cannot impute to a particular agent or particular intention in a policy, in economic policy, then yes, then there is a difference.
You mentioned at the outset the attempt here to provide an analysis and a kind of a rigorous concept of manipulation. And So there are kind of two twin problems. I mentioned before the fact that philosophers often neglect manipulation and focus on coercion, but there's also the opposite in non-philosophical or non-academic discourse where people call everything manipulation, right? So we have the extremes, neither of which is helpful, because if everything is manipulation, then we lose track of we don't have a rigorous concept to work with. And I think there is a distinct tendency to associate things of grave consequence with these kinds of evils, whether compulsion, coercion, manipulation. So when you think about something like poverty or, extreme distress, someone who is, suffering from a horrible disease or something, we want to ascribe this to some horrible term like coercion, exploitation, manipulation.
Yes.
And this is something to suffer from an illness. That doesn't mean that they are being exploited, manipulated, etc. And I think the same would hold for various kinds of situations in which people, but that does not entail that we're talking about either coercion or manipulation. Both of those are, in our analysis, intentional concepts.
That's why the devil has such a big role. The devil intentions to explain the evils in the world and the evil kingdom. And but the devil is in the details, and we don't subscribe to the devil as an explanation.
Right. So in the end, you say it in a few ways. What we're going to talk about, what is manipulation? It's a sort of a subversive, sneaky, undermining power, one where you harness the person's own psychology, and it's compulsion, but it's non-coercive. But in your own words, how would you sum up what is manipulation then after this?
Manipulation is the non-coercive imposition of one person's will over another, typically by means of exploiting mental vulnerabilities. These can be emotional, they can be mental, cognitive, they can be the imagination, and a host of mental vulnerabilities that people have by virtue of sometimes circumstance, like ignorance, you don't know something and I can deceive you and lie to you, or by virtue of, mental weaknesses we all have, our tendency to rationalize, which is something we go into at some length in the book. Confirmation bias, we're all subject to, these kinds of biases. All these are vulnerabilities that expert manipulators know how to exploit. And the way in which they are being exploited is in order to subject the victim's will to the manipulator's will, to get you to do what they want to do and not what you want to do.
Right. And the image that's very helpful for me was a puppet on a string.
Yes, that would be kind of the paradigm motto of what a manipulator or a manipulated person is like. So they move, their own body parts move, but somebody else is controlling their movements.
Okay.
Still pulling the strings is still the idiom that we retain. Pulling strings.
Right. Oh, good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah.
We juxtapose this notion of puppet on strings to a dog on a leash.
Right.
Coercion is like a dog on a leash, and manipulation is puppet on strings, if you like the image.
Yeah, and if we have time, we'll get into how effective images are. But that's an example, actually. I kept thinking of that when I wanted to know what manipulation is, that image of the puppet on the string. So let's get into some of the examples. One of the discussions you had is about people in groups and whether people in groups are more likely to be manipulated. And there was this unbelievable quotation from James Madison, the author of the Constitution. If you had to pick one person, it would be James Madison of the U.S. Constitution. He says, had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. That's astounding to me. Could you talk about that, about the effect of a group and how that affects manipulation?
This was a big topic at the end of the 19th century and the beginning, namely the psychology of the crowd. And the point is the crowd creates a dynamics of the lowest common denominator rather than elevating people. And the psychology, and we go into it, about the psychology of the crowd, it got a bad name, this psychology of the crowd, as a part of social psychology. But we think that the issue of manipulation is well entrenched in this psychology of the crowd. And we didn't want to write a book about Trump, but the Trump's gatherings is a fantastic example of what crowd psychology is like.
Yes.
And the dynamics between the speaker and the crowd is crucial in this. I mean, obviously the crowd is already receptive, then it enhances. And this is why many of the demagogues are also stand-upists. They try to give good time by sort of provoking base emotions.
Yes.
The people think they are ashamed to think even those things when they are on their own, and sort of getting the strength when they are in a crowd.
Yes, I wanted to read a passage from your book about that. Page 191. Demagogues, this is in the chapter about demagoguery. Demagogues are often hailed as, quote, men of the people who, quote, tell it like it is. What this really means is they express what should not be expressed, thereby releasing others from the constraints of civilized society. They allow people to feel comfortable with their worst inclinations. Their bullying is a license, indeed a vindication of our bullying. If the leader can be vulgar, sexist, xenophobic, or what have you, then surely so can we. Moreover, the demagogue offers people the enticing sensation of transgression, either directly by acting out their hatreds, bigotries, misogyny, or violence, or vicariously through his transgressions. Joining him is a license to ignore the rules, or rather to take pride in breaking them. And all done in a group which kind of, I mean, what I keep hearing about is humans are so social. We're so irredeemably social. The crowd, just being a part of a big group, is just exhilarating.
True, but the reason why this idea of the crowd was so pronounced, let's say, in the 19th century, and less so now, is because it was crowd within a confined space. It was a gathering or whatever it was. And I think that the master of propaganda, Goebbels, understood that the radio is an amazing instrument of creating crowd without being in one place, and but being in the certain time. And I think that radios were provided.
Yes.
I think you hadn't had to pay money to get radio in Nazi Germany at least in a certain period.
Mm-hmm.
So you can create crowd through the instruments, not necessarily through a space.
Right.
And
that, of course, took this to a whole other level in our day, right? You create a public space without people being in the same place. So you overcome...
in the same Facebook group.
Right. You overcome the barrier of geography, and also you overcome the limitations of space, right? So you can only have so many people in one gathering, but you can have many people watching your podcast can be...
Yeah, absolutely.
You can reach. And that creates a kind of optimism at one point, and then a conundrum. I think we all saw this when social media was beginning, and it kind of coincided with things like the Arab Spring, and there was this inclination to celebrate the possibilities that are offered by social media, this kind of democratization of political organizing. But very soon after, we begin to see the deleterious effects of this, right? Because like every other instrument, it can be used for good or for bad. And you will always find those bad actors who are going to abuse these instruments. Right. So basically what we're talking about here, and this has been the major challenge since the 19th century, is mass politics, right? How do you conduct mass politics that are democratic, so people are engaged and involved and their opinions matter, but at the same time, those opinions are not being puppeteered, right? The strings are being pulled by some interested parties. And this is the fundamental normative or moral conundrum that we try to explore with this notion of manipulation, because we have this image. So think about the market, right? On the market, we have a similar issue where we say, why are markets good? Because markets can satisfy people's preferences optimally, right? Well, that only makes sense if you take preferences as a given. But of course, we all know that markets don't just satisfy preferences, they also modify and create preferences and shape preferences. And that creates a kind of circularity that really kind of chips at the foundations of the justifications of the market and raise serious questions, I think, about this whole endeavor that we call advertising. But there's something similar that happens with democracy, because democracy too is justified in terms of its ability to address or to be answerable to the desires, the opinions, the preferences of us, the citizens, the population. But if those very politicians who are supposed to be addressing and satisfying our desires also shape our opinions and desires, then we have a vicious circularity at the foundation of the whole system. So in other words, democracy or free society cannot survive when manipulation is rife.
Yeah, it's hard to be optimistic when you say that. But, right. So one big part of it is when our model might be a group of people all getting together and having a discussion. But what happens now is people can choose what group they want to listen to. There are different camps that people can go into and can be a part of their own group, but there's no actual discussion across groups.
Right.
Yes, I mean, there were people who saw the remedy for coercion and violence is talking, namely words. And parliament is from parler, so from talking and convincing and arguing. The point is that it's a double-edged instrument, talking, and not necessarily the most effective one, because a great deal of persuasion goes with the form of life, presenting an example of something which is attractive, and we try actually to indicate the vulnerabilities that goes with talking.
Yeah. And a particular issue here is this notion of the market of ideas, right? This is a very powerful image that people have, which goes along with this idea that this supposed market of ideas can be optimally conducted in the same kind of freedom that we ascribe to the free market. Now, I won't go into the very familiar questions of to what extent that works with the free market. But it certainly is irrelevant and misleading to think about the market, the supposed market of ideas in this sense. So the idea that in order to optimize our public discourse, all we need is to remove all kinds of limitations, barriers, and standards, that idea is maybe very attractive, but it's very problematic. And we think that it's largely responsible to a great extent, to the current predicament that we face, which you have just described, just one aspect of it, right? This kind of siphoning into different information bubbles, as sometimes people call it. But there are various other aspects to it. For instance, we don't have agreed upon epistemic authorities, right? So, philosophers tend to think or to focus on knowledge based on, empirical study, right? We observe the world. That rarely happens, right? Most of our knowledge is based on testimony, whether from books or from our teachers or our parents or whatever it may be, which means that our epistemic makeup depends to a vast extent on trust. We need to trust those institutions, right? So you read this book, but people read it before you and they gave it some credence, right? It was refereed as we do in academic work. When there's news on television, it used to be that you knew there was an editor, you knew that if the reader reads out some news item, it was checked, at least vetted to some extent.
Right.
When you have a situation where people no longer trust in these authorities, we no longer have an agreed upon epistemic foundation. And then what we have is the opposite of communication. And we have miscommunication and misunderstanding rather than not agreement, but disagreement. So one point that we try to make, and Avishai has made this point in the past, is that disagreement is an accomplishment. When you are able to disagree with someone, you already share a vast amount of agreement, of understanding, at least for the terms that you're using to even make sense, which is something we know from the philosophy of language. And it seems that when we don't have that shared understanding or shared space of epistemic makeup, we don't even have the ability to disagree in a cogent manner. And then society falls apart, at least the ability to conduct our disagreements and to make collective decisions, that breaks down. And what you're left with is either power, force, or manipulation.
Right. And so it tells us, and one of the things you talk about is one great thing for the manipulator to do is to, I trust, right? I saw one of your quotes was, we don't need someone in the Brexit debate. We've had enough of experts, right?
There's one kind of manipulation where I try to kind of bombard you with a certain viewpoint, hoping that it kind of seeps in. There's another where I simply undermine the credibility of the standard epistemic authorities. And that's one thing that you mentioned is one example of this.
I think that in the case of Brexit, the interesting thing that, if I remember correctly, the one who said it was Michael Gove, who is an intellectual, someone who can think and take ideas seriously personally. But here, politics, took over, and he said this.
Interesting.
This menacing thing.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. That's helpful.
Donald Trump himself said, I think it was in his first term as president, to one reporter, he said, I attack you because then people won't trust you when you criticize me.
Yeah. Okay. Another topic that you discuss is a section called consciousness raising, which I found very interesting. I want to read a quotation from it. This is from Aldous Huxley. The propagandist is a man who makes a canal out of an already existing stream. In a land where there is no water, he digs in vain. Tell us about that quotation and what it can tell us.
Well, unlike, I think the juxtaposition with coercion here may be helpful, right? So when somebody coerces you, all they need is to make a credible threat. A gun to the head is a really credible threat, right? You don't need any shared understanding of anything. He doesn't need to know who you are, where you come from. He needs to know very little, primarily that you desire to continue living, right? When it comes to manipulation, most often, things are much more nuanced. A good manipulator, a propagandist, or a demagogue must be sensitive to his audience in a way that is much more intricate than that. He needs to know what makes them tick. He needs to know what their anxieties and fears are. He needs to know what their aspirations are. He needs to know how to tap into their kind of innermost emotions and imaginations. And I think that's at least how I understand that quotation.
Yeah.
About the existing stream. You tap into something that is already there. In this sense, we spoke about the parity between coercion and manipulation before, but here there is a contrast. And the contrast is that coercion mostly appears as a kind of crushing force. It crushes your desires, your decisions, your choices. With manipulation, there's something different going on. It harnesses your own mental capacities.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's often experienced as something that is pleasing, that is something that is even enjoyable. as a kind of release, like you mentioned before when we talked about those rallies. So in this sense, one of the important aspects of manipulation is that not always, but quite often, the person being manipulated has a role to play. He's a party in how manipulation is conducted, unlike the person being coerced, who is merely a passive subject of coercion. In manipulation, it's oftentimes not the case. It is our own fears, it's our own inclinations, it's our own desires that are being played by an expert manipulator.
Right. And it's a great example of our weaknesses that are being taken advantage of here. You have another quote here on the same topic. Victor Klemperer. Actually, if you could say who that is, that would be helpful also. But Victor Klemperer described Hitler's propaganda as intended to, quote, nurture, legitimize, and as it were, glorify the instinctive hatred of the Jews. In the process, he plays on which is the weakest spot in the cultural thinking of the nation. Who was Victor Klemperer?
For one thing, he was the brother of the famous conductor Klemperer. And he stayed in Germany during the war, hiding there, and wrote a detailed diary, which is perhaps one of the most important, I think, documents of the 20th century. And in terms of what the experience looked like, it wasn't just, he was a shrewd observer from his hiding, but apart from that, he could articulate how it felt, what it was like being under sort of this hellish regime.
And he also wrote a book about the language of the Third Reich, which is where this quotation I think is from, which analyzes the distinct way in which Nazis used language in their propaganda.
He himself was a professor of literature, linguist, and I think it was mainly French literature, but I'm not sure, and sort of, and had a first-rate mind.
Kind of an ethnography, what it was like at that time?
Yes, and a very good musical ear to how language works in politics. Hence the conductor association.
Yes.
Might be relevant in a way.
That's helpful, yeah. In that section, you also say something which is in the United States that just resonated so strongly with me. You say, it is unsurprising, we should not be surprised to find radical critique fueling reactionary populism. That seems to be what happens in the US. You have political correctness and you have a reactionary you have a reaction. You have wokeness. You have a very strong reaction. Could you elaborate more on why that's not surprising to find radical critique fueling reactionary populism?
Well, for one thing, I think in the States, there was a post-Vietnam cultural war of understand. Then the Clinton actually exemplified part of the cultural war, and Obama later on. And here, the reason I think there is a great deal of exaggeration about political correctness, what it was like, and a war, what it was like. But there was a feeling of tremendous intensity. And what is mirrored here is the intensity. I mean, people are bored stiff with sort of the middle ground. It looks sort of banal or sheer, simple common sense. I mean, just looks banal. The intensity is something that I think is attractive, and that's why extremes sort of match one another.
I point to one specific aspect of this, which has to do, I mean, we spoke before about the undermining of epistemic authorities. But there's also something else that happened, and that is questioning the very credibility of the notion of truth. And this is something that we have to admit emerged from the left side of kind of the political, social landscape. But it was very quickly picked up by reactionary forces. So we talked before about the need for a shared epistemic space, but underlying that is the need for a notion of truth. Now, I don't want to get into, deep philosophical questions about the metaphysics of truth, but when we talk about social reality, we have very clear and distinct ideas about what truth means. And when we lose a grip on the very notion of truth, whether it even exists or whether it is attainable, that's when we lose the ability to conduct our public affairs in a cogent and rational way. So when Steve Bannon, who was Trump's close advisor, said, you need to flood the zone with shit, right? This is how he encapsulated his tactic. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that I don't need you to agree with me or to think that what I'm saying is the absolute truth. It's enough that you no longer have the confidence that it's even possible to know the truth, right? There's so much shit going on. You don't even know what it means to come to terms with reality anymore. And when people give up on that, all that's left is basically power relations. So I think that's
basically, what was the last word?
Power relations, right?
Oh, power relations, right.
We can't conduct ourselves in conversation, debate, agreement, argument. What is left? Well, what is left is, who is more powerful.
Right. Do either of you know this story of the Narodniki well enough to speak to it, what that was about?
A little bit.
Could you please? I thought it was interesting. If you could just introduce it, I thought it was fascinating.
Well, the Narodniki basically were mostly young people in 19th century Russia. The slogan, the name was going to the people. And the idea was, there's this elitist regime, the Tsarist regime, which is exploiting the people, taking advantage of them, ruling them from above, from the capital. They are disconnected. They are, in today's terms, globalists, right? So they marry with the French and the British and all that. They're not genuine, true, authentic of the people. And the people are being subjugated by them because they don't realize the structure. And what we need to do is to go to the people. These are kind of intellectual types from the cities.
Yeah.
We would go to the people and mobilize them. And the way to do so would be raising consciousness, right? We just have to educate them about this exploitative structure, and then they will rise up. And there's just some interesting, even funny stories or anecdotes related with it, which is most of these folks, when they went to the actual people in the outskirts, in the villages and towns, and they started speaking against the Tsar, people would beat them up and shout at them and curse them because they genuinely believed and revered the Tsar.
Right.
So that was just one instance or example to make the point that this notion of consciousness raising, if we just educate the common folk about the true reality to which they're blind, then they will rise up. It doesn't take seriously the extent to which these people genuinely believe in these ideologies.
Right.
The point about the Narodniki is that there was a tremendous sacrifice there. They actually lived in the most miserable places in Russia, in villages, and trying to be assimilated to the village life and so on. And it went, people suspected them. They looked funny or bizarre. Why do they come from comfortable life to be here?
Yeah.
But eventually, sometimes they even gain sympathy, and after a while, namely sometimes after half a year or a year, they started criticizing the Tsar or
the church.
Or the church. Then suddenly the whole thing probably.
Sure.
It wasn't just the silly picture in which many are in the grip of, that the Narodniki came to those places and just preached.
Right.
And therefore countered hostile peasants and mujiks that hated them. That wasn't the case. The case was far more elaborate.
Right. Let's talk about conspiracy theories. I first of all thought it was interesting. Let's first distinguish between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. Why don't you speak to that? It was a good point, but I hadn't really realized it was something that people confuse, but I realize I confuse it too. Yeah.
Right. So we distinguish between theories of conspiracies and conspiracy theories because some conspiracies are real.
Right.
Right? We know that there were conspiracies, the Iran-Contras affair, that was a conspiracy, right? There were others. And anyone who writes a book about the Iran-Contras is offering a theory about a conspiracy.
Right.
And that's something totally different from what we have in mind when about conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories, as we analyze them, their essence resides not in whether they are true or false. The essence of a conspiracy theory is a very distinct epistemic structure or justification structure in which you posit the existence of a cabal, right, a conspiracy, whose main attribute is deep secrecy, right? So you can't know about it and it hides itself. And the way this concealment works in the theory is as a hedge or a trump card against any kind of counter evidence, right? So if there's no evidence for the conspiracy, that just proves that there's a conspiracy. Why? Because that's what the theory posits, that the conspiracy covers its tracks, right? And throws hints to throw you off the track. This kind of epistemic structure, which makes it seals off any evidence, is the true mark of a conspiracy theory.
The other evidentiary point is what you were saying about the devil, is this idea that if there's something that happened, it must have been that someone or a group of people got together to cause.
Right. There's this intentionality being assumed. So if something horrible happens, number one, it has to be the product of human intentions. It can't just be coincidence or mere chance. But also, it has the extent of the intentionality has to be proportional to the consequences of what happened. So if President Kennedy is being assassinated, it can't be just some unhinged lone gunman who thought of this and carried it out.
Right.
It has to be a vast conspiracy involved. Why? Well, because the implications are so enormous. It can't just be, and I think this is something interesting about human psychology. We have this aversion to incorporating the idea that so much of our lives is being determined by chance.
Yeah.
We'd rather think that there is some horrible intentionality behind it, be it a conspiracy or the Satan, and just say, shit happens, right?
Yeah.
Life is just a conjunction of chances and occurrences.
Yeah, as you know, I think it was Sandy Hook. There's a school shooting. Someone goes and kills people in a school, and immediately it's a false flag. There's something behind it.
It's very interesting that the Warren report about the assassination of Kennedy was believed, at least to a large extent, by people in the United States, but not in Europe. No one in Europe at the time believed in the report. And I think, I don't know. I mean,
Can you tell me? I don't know what was the conclusion of the Warren report. It said there was a conspiracy, or it said there was not. There was not.
It was not. They just no. It was Oswald, and so.
Why would that be that the Europeans would not believe it?
Because I think they are more theoretical minded. And the American, they read sort of the big, or at least it used to be more of a. I mean, you need a theory to explain it, and therefore, and if it's a theory, then you magnify the motives, you magnify the whole picture. And of course, the point whether it was Oswald on his own, or whether there were other people, if you assume that 10 people participated in the plot, you explain everything.
Right.
But the point, what you cannot explain is the conspiracy of these 10.
Right. Right.
So people posited all sorts of, helper.
Right. And conspiracy theories become an instrument of manipulation when certain political actors use them in order to basically control what people think and stories they tell themselves. And here I think a key notion is this idea of rationalization, right?
Absolutely.
So we abhor having to admit we were wrong. And even worse is not being wrong, but being taken for a fool, taken for a ride by somebody else. So when somebody manages to pull one over us, it is sometimes easier to go along and double down than to admit we had been fooled.
Right. Absolutely.
And mass manipulators and con men of the type you now have in the White House know how to use this very, very adeptly.
Absolutely.
But yeah,
go ahead.
When you discovered that you were manipulated, what was the main emotion?
Shame.
I think embarrassment plays a great deal of role. Namely, I would go for shallow psychology. Embarrassment looks trivial, but part of, now let's talk from the side of the manipulators. If you look at many governments, and then they would do everything, recruit spin doctors in order to avoid trivial embarrassment.
Yes.
I mean, to be embarrassed in public space looks to them as a real horror. I mean, I think...
And yes, this is the thing that has changed.
Yes, still Trump came to the fore and he's shameless.
Yes.
And he actually...
Shame is premised on an incompatibility between the standards you uphold and your actual behavior.
Right.
When you fail to live up to your own standards or the standards of your community, that's where shame comes in. When there's no shame, it means the standards have been eroded. Tossing away standards and norms, as you mentioned Trump, but you can also think about someone like Boris Johnson. You can talk about our own prime minister. There's a new brand of, it's not totally new. We mentioned in the book previous demagogues and leaders who were they seemed like buffoons to other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Buffoon to many of the outside observers. But part of it, this buffoonery is not incidental. It's part of the making of these kinds of leaders, because that expresses the total disregard, the undermining of the standards and the norms that underlie the very possibility of embarrassment or shame.
Right. I wanted to talk about QAnon here. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but that was one where it wasn't, I don't think Trump had anything to do with starting it, but he took advantage of it after it was there. And that's really interesting, because I kind of feel like the people who believe in that, a lot of the belief is performative, that they could doubt it, but it's kind of this virtual reality or this entertainment, really, to believe in these bizarre things. Does that resonate for you?
Yes, I think if you think that the world is run from a tiny place in Brooklyn or wherever, and this is the sort of the source of all the... Yeah, I mean, the point you're making, the point or questioning is whether people believe in it.
Right.
Whether the true believers are true believers.
Yes.
And the point is not necessarily, it's a good story. From their point of view, it's a good story. And it presents the opponents or the enemies sort of in the worst of light. And the point is really, dim light is not enough. You have to present them in the worst of light. This is sort of as pervert, as a sexual pervert. And and this is as the main motive of... and then come Epstein and confirm them. I mean...
Oh, I know, right? Right. That is fascinating. That is right.
Let me add one thought to this. One concept that we try to explore in the book is what we call epistemic hedonism. So the idea is basically this: we have a tendency to think about belief as oriented towards truth, right? This is the function of belief is to give us kind of knowledge about the world, etc.
Right.
But if you think about it psychologically, belief actually plays a much more intricate and complex role in our mental lives. believing certain things give us confirmation. It gives us orientation in the world. It gives us solace sometimes.
A community.
Sometimes the opposite, anxiety, fear. And when you think about it that way, one of the things that belief does for us is it provides us with the resources for orienting ourselves in the world, not just epistemically, but emotionally.
Yeah.
And one of the features that we know from various kinds of psychological and cognitive phenomenon like confirmation bias is that we have a tendency, we want to hold as true those things that make us feel better and reject or put off those things that make us feel bad, right?
Mm.
So that's basically what epistemic hedonism is about. It's structuring your beliefs not in proportion to the evidence, but in accordance with your psychic motivations, what makes you feel good or what makes you feel bad. And QAnon, I think, is a good example of something that people can entertain, even if not fully believe, and bracket the question of, do I really believe this or not? There's this kind of vague in-between space where you simply entertain the thought because it makes you feel good. It confirms your worldview or the space that you happen to inhabit socially, etc., or things that you've done in the past and you don't want to admit to being foolish about them. And then I think at some point, the line between do I seriously believe it or not, I think it evaporates at some point, right? So it's hard to ask what those people really think. I actually
Right.
someone who was, as far as I could tell, all in on QAnon. And then when it kind of disappeared, it dissipated after a while, they simply let it go, right? And if you were to ask them, they would say, no, I never truly believed it. I just thought it was interesting.
Mm.
So I think we veer in and out in a way that is very hard to pin down to, do you truly believe it or not, as some of us philosophers would like to have.
Right. I had a philosopher, teacher, professor in college, Sidney Morgenbesser, who said that the way you deal with a global skeptic, meaning someone who says we're just brains and bad, is to say, yeah, you're right. And then they say, no, because really, and you say, yeah, no, I completely agree. And I feel like that's the response to QAnon also. I mean, people are doing it partly to be the center of, partly to piss people off, right? Your friend may have this was a way to get attention and say something provocative and piss you off.
Well, I remember Sidney Morgenbesser.
Did you know Sidney?
Very well.
Oh, really? That's fantastic.
Very well. And he held a class on Marxism, and one of the students said to him, Professor, don't you know that there is no contradiction between truth and falsity? It's a dialectic relation. He said to him, yes and no.
Yeah, no, he was fantastic.
So that was one.
Yeah, I think there's a whole nother discussion about whether universities still have people like that, right?
He's a unique specimen. I mean, you don't produce you need the Lower East Side for one thing in order to.
Right. So the other thing about QAnon is, I think that a lot of people really like the way they were investigating it. They were active. They were looking online and finding links. And, they're not just taking something. They're going around, they're researching, they're actively involved in it.
Yeah, that's part of the appeal of many conspiracy theories, right? QAnon had that slogan, question the narrative, right? So where does that pick up from? It takes up a healthy kind of skepticism, right? You should question the narrative. You should question authorities. You should be skeptical of experts. But it's a very thin line from there to a kind of blanket a priori, not questioning, but assumption of guilt, assumption that there must be a conspiracy. If these people say so, it must be false. There must be something wrong going on. That's where you move from healthy skepticism to a kind of paranoid conspiracy theory.
Okay, well, I appreciate you going a little bit over, and I realize I did not even read your bios, so let me just say that now. Avishai Margalit is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at Hebrew University of Jerusalem and former George F. Kennan Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. The recipient of numerous prizes, he is the author of The Decent Society, The Ethics of Memory, On Compromise and Rotten Compromises, and on betrayal. Assaf, Sharon is professor of philosophy at Tel Aviv University, co-founder and senior fellow at Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy. He has written for the New York Review of Books, Boston Review, and Liberties. And I should say we're speaking in October 2026, so we're almost 3 years into the Israeli-Hamas war. I much respect for you guys to keep on your work in such a difficult, in a war zone. And I'll mention also that this book is dedicated to all innocent lives, Israeli and Palestinian, lost in the war. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, August.
Thank you for having us.